Welcome back, everybody. As far as I'm concerned, this panel is the most important panel of the three-day conference. We have a veterans panel, all individuals who have served and sacrificed for our country. And we believe this is the longest veterans panel that any conference has had, and this was something that was both personal and important to me and the individuals that are sitting at this table. I think it will be compelling, I think it will be interesting, and I think you will be touched. I'd like to introduce each individual personally and have them talk a little bit about themselves. So first, I'd like to introduce Ryan Miller. Ryan Miller is a captain, retired. Thank you for your service, sir.
Appreciate it, Michael. Oh, hello, thank you. Thank you very much for coming and joining us here for this. There we go. This is gonna be mine. For this talk. So again, my name's Ryan Miller. It's a name you're gonna hear again and again and again because you'll see in a minute. I'm originally from New York City. I'll tell you, when I went to West Point, and if you had told me I was a West Point cadet, I would be in beautiful LA talking about cannabis. I would have thought you were nuts. This is back in the early 2000s. Graduated West Point, was an infantry officer, deployed to Iraq in 2007, and during the height of the surge, and was on the wrong side of a roadside bomb in October of that year. Was severely wounded, had severe damage to my leg, internal organ damage, and spent the next 3 years on very heavy doses of opiates and Klonopin and other pain and psychotropic medications while I attempted to save my leg. Eventually, I did amputate my leg. Interestingly enough, one of the reasons I wanted to get the amputation was for pain, but I was a very fortunate case in that I had already gotten into grad school, so I had immediate future plans. I had a really strong support group when I was recovering at the best place in the world down in Center for the Intrepid at Fort Sam Houston, Texas. So I'll wrap it up. So, fast forward many years later after grad school, I come out to California. I start meeting the veteran community. I start hearing people tell me cannabis saved my life. First time you hear it, you're like, okay. You hear it over and over again. You realize these people there's something behind that. Started using cannabis myself to treat some of the now mental things that, I gotten taking care of the physical ones, started treating the mental things, and got so close to this plant and its culture that decided to enter the industry. So I entered the industry in 2016.
Thank you. And if you don't mind standing right over here, because okay. I think we all suffer, we all have stress in our life, but I'm doing this simply to make you all understand the degree of suffering and sacrifice. Will you please lift your left pant leg, sir? Thank you for your sacrifice.
I guess I'm better at show and tell than brevity.
Okay, we have another Miller. We have Michael Miller, Ryan Miller 1, and now Corporal Ryan Miller number 2. Thank you for your service, sir.
Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for coming out today. I am the other Ryan Miller. I was born in San Francisco, not New York. And after high school, I joined the Marine Corps. And I was stationed in Okinawa, Japan. And from there, I deployed to Brunei, Bali, Indonesia, Malaysia, Singapore, Philippines, Hong Kong, Thailand, Australia, and Korea twice. And notice I didn't mention Afghanistan. And notice I didn't mention Iraq. And these are the top 2 places everyone asks me about when I self-identify as a veteran. So for the decade following my honorable discharge, I allowed the lack of combat experience to inform me of an unfulfilled military experience. And that manifested itself in the way of depression eating, comfort napping, alcoholism, excessive pornography use, ripping out my toenails. And over time, I worked my way out of that through a lot of exercise and meditation and plant medicine. And I arrived at a certain level of healing. And I received an opportunity to start leading support groups for military veterans at a cannabis dispensary that I was working at, Harborside Health Center. And that, helping other troops, enabled me to arrive at an even higher level of healing that I thought was possible. And so through Operation EVAC, we host recurring social support groups for veterans at cannabis dispensaries. Our community suffers from 22 suicides every single day. And in the 5 years of this work, we haven't lost a single body to self-harm. Can we clap it up for that one time, please? Thank you. So plant medicine, including cannabis and psychedelics also, I'm just going to mention that, has saved my life. And I'm hoping to share my story to help save some other lives today also. Thank you.
Thank you for sharing your story with us. Airborne Specialist, Sean Kernan. Thank you for your service, sir.
My background actually was just right down the street. I went to Crespi High School, and then I was 17, failing most of my classes, and said, I got to get away from my dad. So I joined right off Victory. I went to the recruiter's office and signed up. So I know thank you service, but a lot of my decision wasn't even about serving. It was about the best opportunity I had to accomplish what I wanted, which is to get away from my family. And that's what we see a lot. Is it's a I call it a socioeconomic draft with our volunteer military. Some people don't like it, but it's really meant to talk about the demographic that we are, and the enlisted veteran community comes from those poor and working class areas, whether they're immigrants or whether they're inner city or whether it's farming communities or just middle class America. And so help run an organization called the Weed for Warriors Project. I served in Central America, signed up in '89, got out at the end of '93, and then I went on to a career on Wall Street. When I left Wall Street, when I was forced to leave Wall Street in 2009 because of the economy, I never went back and kind of faded into my issues and my stories that I never dealt with. And then ended up working with Sue Sisley a little bit under advocacy at the University of Arizona, and then was asked to join a group called the Weed for Warriors Project back in 2015. And now I run it with a bunch of great disabled vets. We're all disabled vets, and we have chapters throughout the country, in California from San Diego all the way up north, big in the Oakland area, and basically we meet once a month, and at those meetings these veterans have this safety support network. Their spouses, their family meet other family members so they're not alone, and we give out free cannabis donated by the industry, what used to be the industry, and now it's basically all traditional because we're in the position of what we do is actually illegal, which is giving away free medicine in the state of California, which is horrible. So we're fighting along with some of the panelists like Ryan Miller for SB 34 in Sacramento, which is going to take the tax off so we can hopefully jumpstart the industry's compassion, because we need the industry and we need the patients to come together. It's one of the big areas right now. The industry is trying to serve a group that can't afford its medicine, and so we've got to figure out how to make this work, and that's less regulation, less taxes, and really keeping in mind the altruistic part of what we do.
Thank you so much. Life Griffith, Sergeant First Class. Thank you for your service, Life.
Thank you. First and foremost, I'm really touched right now to see my fellow veterans here, because sometimes we are veterans, we never get the real acceptance like those who came home from Vietnam. So for those in the audience, if you was a veteran or you are a veteran, can you raise your hands just so I can see you if you're a veteran? All right, let's give them a round of applause. Okay, so I'm gonna give you a little background about me. Again, my name is Life Darrell Griffith. I'm the Executive Director of Veterans Health Solutions First to Care. It's a nonprofit public benefit corporation teaching minorities and the underserved the importance of hemp as well as cannabis, and also teaching them how to get into the business. I served 19 years as a combat medic, military policeman. I worked in JAG. JAG just means Judge Advocate General. In 2015, I was the head of the minority program here of the VA, helping veterans in those urban communities that sometimes you never see or hear about, teaching them about the benefits. I was forced to retire due to an injury that was sustained in Afghanistan. My legs were shattered in 9 different places, so I have metal on both of my legs. On the same day, my son, when I was forced to retire, was diagnosed with leukemia. So my fight became a bit more personal. Right now, I've done a lot of work in Los Angeles in the urban area. I decided to move to Georgia because I was watching what was going on there. And so now I'm working with some other cannabis groups and veteran groups in Georgia, but I also wanted to come back here to share my story with all of you. So I want to thank you for this time, and I hope that what I have to tell you will resonate and that you will share that with those that are your loved ones that are veterans or military service members. Thank you.
Thank you, Lev. Marine Chief Warrant Officer Joy Craig. Thank you for your service.
I appreciate it. Hi, everyone. I'm happy to be here. Thank you so much. My name is Joy Craig. I retired in 2014 after serving 23 years in the United States Marine Corps. I served 17 of those years enlisted and became an officer towards the end of my career. Excuse me. My personal mission right now is to see cannabis legalized nationally so that veterans in every state are not criminalized for seeking out the medicine that they need. I'm also on a personal rampage to squash out sexual assault in the military. Let's applaud that. Please applaud that. Thank you. It's a tough fight. It's a tough fight. I was personally assaulted, I say at least 2 times in my career, once pretty dramatically when I was a young Marine, once again when I was an old Marine, and a lot of little times in between, because sexual assault isn't just the full-blown monster thing that you think about. It's a lot of little daily things too. And so changing the paradigm in the military so that we can take that on head on is incredibly important. But I found that the thing that helps me get through those tough days when I'm reliving some of those demons is cannabis. After I retired, I had a little fall from grace, and it was not pretty. And cannabis is what pulled me up out of it. I am a believer in this medicine. I'm going to fight for this until I see it nationally legalized, and I see that my veteran friends are no longer considered criminals for trying to get this medicine. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Joy. The hemp colonel himself, Todd Scattini. Thank you for your service, Todd.
Thanks, everyone. My name is Todd Scattini. I am probably the newest veteran, I think, on the panel. I retired just 18 months ago after wearing the uniform for 27 years. I was born and raised in California, and I enlisted when I was 19 years old. Once I enlisted, I served for about 2.5 years as an enlisted man, and I was accepted to West Point. And once I graduated from West Point, I became an armor officer, and then a foreign area officer, which is kind of a military diplomat. It's a special type of officer that the Army trains to focus on particular regions of the world. And because I had picked up a few European languages along the way, I was lucky enough to have Europe as the region that I focused on. During that time, I also served in Afghanistan for 6 months as a special advisor to one of the senior officers, actually the commander of the entire International Security Assistance Forces, who asked me a question. He asked me to figure out a way to create an industry for Afghanistan using the resources that they have. I knew they had 3. They had minerals, the Chinese owned them all. They had opium, which I had very little use for, and they had cannabis. And like I said, I'm from California. I'm also the grandson of a California cotton farmer, so I know a little bit about cannabis and I know a little bit about growing things. And I said, let's change them to a hemp-based industry, right, with 25,000 different uses and 8,000 years of human history. We've nearly evolved with this plant. Why don't we transition them to that? And then the bonus would be you grow hemp around cannabis for high THC, and all of the THC levels would drop in that cannabis, and so it kind of a win-win situation. I thought it was very clever, and they thought it was Cheech and Chong. So it didn't go over very well, but I was simply hooked on the subject. As I began to research cannabis, and I noted the racist roots of our prohibition, as I noted the unequal application of cannabis prohibition laws and what that has done to communities, it didn't seem kind of reflective of the country that I had signed up to defend. And I was so proud of that service. I also recognized that there were economic impacts that were taking place. When we boldly legalized medical cannabis here in 1996, thanks to the courage of gay activists trying to save their own population, we made that change right here. And I was super proud of it. So I saw also that there were agricultural impacts that are going to take place from this plant and from the re-legalization of cannabis with our original crop. I mean, cannabis and hemp flow through our nation. The history of our nation was built on the back of hemp, and it's been re-legalized now. And just wait and watch and see what happens. It's going to be amazing. But I think what's most exciting is that, recognizing that I came out into a population of veterans, people who have served, who are clearly, much like the rest of our nation, in the midst of a massive health crisis, where 22 people who served their nation, who signed up to die on behalf of their nation if necessary, will decide to put a pistol in their mouth today. And that is awful. 10 more will die with a needle in their arm because of an opioid addiction. Many times an opioid addiction that was gained within the military and is then supported later on through our healthcare system. And recognizing the non-toxic nature of cannabis and the massive amounts of anecdotal evidence and increasing scientific evidence that go with this plant, I felt it was my duty to bring light to this and shine a light. So I'm incredibly proud to be on the stage with a bunch of heroes. I am no hero, but I walk among many of them. One that I would like to mention is not on stage with me, nor is she a veteran. But I do want to mention Dr. Sue Sisley over here, who's just kind of hiding in the corner. She's probably one of the biggest heroes in the room. So I just want to recognize her and thank her for her courage and the fight that she put forward so that she could research medical cannabis for veterans. And it took her so long. It took 7 years. Most doctors, I think, would give up. And then when she was given that authorization, the fact that she was fired by her university was something that was shameful. So incredibly indebted. Cheers.
Thank you, Todd. And now, if there was an avenger for a civilian and she was a doctor, she would be the next person that's coming on stage. Sue is an extraordinary person, humanitarian, advocate, friend who never says no to help anybody. And it's an honor for me to share the stage with her today, and of course, Dodger. What a great name for a dog in LA. Come on, buddy. Thank you, Dr. Sue. Can you just talk for about a minute before we sit down? Thank you.
I met many of you guys yesterday at our panel, but I'm so grateful to be on this panel with so many revered veterans. I'm not a veteran, but I've taken care of veterans and their families in my internal medicine practice back in Arizona for almost 20 years now. And I really credit the veterans with teaching me about cannabis as a medicine. That was a completely foreign concept to me, just like most physicians you'll meet. We were never exposed to this during our training. So I really, they helped me initiate my education by bravely disclosing to me about, I think 15 years ago, when really nobody was talking about their use of cannabis. They, boldly disclosed this to me regularly and taught me about this and inspired me to do clinical trials looking at cannabis, trying to put cannabis flower through the entire FDA drug development process. So I'm going to leave it. I want to hear from all these wonderful vets. Thank you for having me.
Thanks, Sue, for all you do. Is he going to hang out under the table? Okay, great. Let's get this panel started. Oh, here we go. I have your mic. Thank you. Why don't we start off with existing government policy, U.S. policy, and how that affects the Veterans Administration with respect to taking care of those who have sacrificed for our country. Life, why don't you start that off?
Well, first, I used to work at the VA from a legal side and also as a minority program coordinator. And basically, as I said, what that meant was that I would go out and teach veterans, the indigenous people, Indians, Asians, blacks, about their benefits, because most veterans are not fully aware of how the VA works. The VA is an old system with an old rule. And certain things, when I started to really research the VA in terms of the internal aspect, there was a puzzling situation. You have two types of veterans. You have the veteran, then you have the minority veteran. And we're treated differently than the veteran concept. And this is another reason why we have to understand the law. So the policy, there's a policy that came out last year in December for medical access to cannabis, Directive 1315, if I remember correctly. And it talks about how the veteran can have access to cannabis, although the doctors cannot prescribe it, although they cannot give it out, they can actually talk about it. But no one told the veteran about this. So when I go out and I talk to the veteran communities where I go, as I tell them that right on the VA website, it tells the veteran that he or she will not lose their benefits if they use cannabis, right? And this big myth about it. And so what I also did, and I would applaud and I would actually instruct, as I normally do, is to learn the law, how to interpret the law. The law is the key to this whole thing. And it's important to understand that the VA is changing, but the system is not changing. Look at how many VA secretaries we've had in the last, say, 5 years, 6 years. They're constantly changing. And every time someone comes in new, it changes again. And another thing that I might add before I pass on to the rest of our distinguished guests here is that each VA system is different. They do it different, even though they have one book they're supposed to follow. So every time you go to a different state, you have to register different, the people are different, the rules are different, and that's very puzzling to our veteran community. Another thing I might add is that we, the veterans, we can no longer rely on government. We have to rely on each other now. And that's why these types of panels are critical to our well-being, because once we take off that uniform, we're really on our own. And that is
You're never going to be on your own.
Yes.
You're never going to be on your own.
Well, you know what I mean.
I do know what you mean.
And so again, the policies are serious. We have a bunch of laws right now that's currently in the Senate. They're constantly taking them out. They're constantly putting them in. They're constantly taking them out. So that's a very confusing state for our veterans. So it's important that we educate the veteran. And one more thing. Veterans know real people. We can tell if you're on the BS or not. We can actually tell instantly if you're really saying thank you for your service because that's a social norm, or if you're really thanking us for our service by getting to know us. We're human. We're not robots as people like to think. And one last thing I might add, PTSD is not a war issue. It's a humane issue. Most of us, or some of us, who come in the military already had PTSD before we walked into the military. And the military adds to it, especially if you went to war, like most of us here. So again, I just want to share that with you, and I don't want to hold too much of time, but those are some of the things I've witnessed, and now I'm just educating everybody as I can, going into the trenches, on the front lines, to ensure that our veterans get taken care of.
Thank you, Life, very much. Joy.
I'm kind of on the fence about the VA. I think they get a lot of bad rap. And some of it is warranted and some of it is not. There are different entities inside the VA. There's the educational part of it, the medical part of it, and they're all kind of acting independently. The medical side of it gets a pretty bad rap, and I know, speaking from the female veteran point of view, a lot of female veterans have no desire to go back to the VA for any kind of medical help whatsoever. The VA motto, if you want to Google something fun, just Google the VA motto, and it tells you why women are so apprehensive to go in there. But they're trying. I will say that the VA is trying to be more inclusive to women. There were some rural hospitals that up until just like last year didn't even have women's bathrooms. So they really don't look at the female, well, they're getting better, but they haven't looked at the female population of veterans as a serious contingent that they need to contend with. So that's changing. But regarding the VA's policy on cannabis, there are some experts here on the panel. They need to become more progressive. They need to get on board. 1 in 5 veterans right now is self-medicating with cannabis, whether they want to accept it or not, and they need to include us.
Thank you. Thank you. Sean?
Yeah, I think it's real simple. I mean, VA policy is federal policy, which is purchased and bought by a bunch of for-profit industries, and we can all name them for the 100th time. And until we as a country start to have a true representative government that accounts for everybody's needs, not just the oligarchy that's controlling everything, and I say this, I've said this for a while, nothing's going to change. And so I think when year after year we hear these agreements that are going to happen that don't happen, I think, when you have the House and the Senate pass multiple years, these VA acts, and they've had different names, that allow doctors to talk, to allow doctors to prescribe, to become more tolerant, and they pass them, and yet they get taken out of reconciliation. That means right before they go to the government, they get yanked out by somebody.
Right.
They're shaking our hand and glad-handing the veteran issue, but at the end of the day, the only thing our government cares about is what the people who pay them want. And when you look at donations and payments to government officials, there's no industry that comes anywhere close to big pharma. It's like 300 million just directly to our Congress. And I think the NRA was like 10 million. It was that big a wide gap. And so nothing's going to change because cannabis threatens all of that.
It sure does. Todd, help us out in this direction with respect to the VA federal law and the potential for positive momentum.
Sure. So I'll be a bit more optimistic, and it's probably my fault. But I'm a dreamer. I come from California, right? And so I guess the main thing that it prevents, obviously, is access for veterans. But the thing that it really subdues or prevents almost entirely, and obviously I can't say entirely since I have living proof sitting next to me, but what we've done is suppress the ability to conduct research on medical cannabis. My goal is to get the Department of Defense, specifically through the VA specifically, and as a subnote, I want to say that I am not here to denigrate the DoD or the Veterans Administration in any manner whatsoever. I would never bite the hand that fed me, or the organization that made me what I believe I am today. But I do believe that there needs to be courageous leadership shown in that particular organization. The same courageous leadership that we were asked to show on the battlefield, I would ask of decision makers within the Department of Defense and within government in general. Currently, the VA will kowtow to the Drug Enforcement Administration and the Department of Justice, both of whom profit greatly from the prohibition of cannabis, despite the fact that the Food and Drug Administration, or the Department of Health and Human Services, on behalf of the Food and Drug Administration, hold patents on cannabinoids for things that can provide neuroprotection, anti-inflammatory properties, antioxidative properties, and none of those have been acted on significantly enough to bring to bear what I believe are not just the military applications to this particular plant, but really to be on the forward edge of a revolution in medical affairs entirely. My goal is to have the DoD's research lens focused on the cannabis plant. If that were to happen, the United States would immediately become the global leader in medical cannabis research in an instant. We currently have, through the Department of Defense and the VA, we have the largest patient population in the country. 9 million veterans rely on the VA for their research, or for their health care. And 85% of those would seek to have access to medical cannabis as an option to treat a number of different ailments that come with service to the nation. If we were to do that, we would have access to that patient population. The Veterans Administration has 152 hospitals across this great country, over 1,000 veterans clinics across this country, and the VA has research relationships with all of the universities across the country. You could ignite that immediately. Additionally, by going with the Department of Defense and the military security cooperation programs that we have around the globe, we could ignite a global network of medical cannabis research for the purpose of addressing things that come through military combat and military service. That includes, the first G7 nation just to our north, our largest and closest NATO ally, Canada. We could be conducting research with them. That includes Israel, for example, who in 1964 was the first, is the home of Dr. Raphael Mechoulam, who in 1964 identified and isolated the tetrahydrocannabinol molecule. And they understand they're being very progressive in their research. We could ignite all of that immediately and truly spawn a revolution in medical affairs and allow great researchers around the globe to really dig into what I believe is a miraculous plant, and to really unpack all of that. It's our responsibility, I think, as human beings, and I think it has an impact across the board on a number of different levels, from social justice impacts, from economic development impacts, agricultural impacts, from growing this plant so efficiently we can translate the way we grow other plants to include our food and potentially change the way we feed our planet. And reduce carbon footprints. But I think the most exciting are truly the health and wellness impacts that I believe are encapsulated in this plant. And I think that we should bring that to bear to save our species from ourselves sometimes.
Thank you, Tom. Thank you very much. Dr. Sue. Thank you. Dr. Sue, even though you are technically an outsider because you don't wear a uniform, you are an insider because of your deep work into the space and being involved with so many personal stories. So take us on your journey with respect to government policy and how that affects your work.
Yeah, I wanted to echo what Todd said. I mean, the barriers to researching cannabis as a medicine are insane, and they particularly don't make sense when, my study sponsor, MAPS, many of you know MAPS is a nonprofit that does a lot of the seminal studies on psychedelics, and work on MDMA, LSD, all these much more toxic pharmaceuticals are flying through the FDA drug development process, but cannabis is stymied at every turn, which is symbolized by our struggle. The study that they're referencing earlier, this FDA phase 2 trial looking at veterans with PTSD, very straightforward clinical trial, randomized controlled trial, should have taken a few years, took us 10 years to navigate all the regulatory barriers and finally complete the study this year. So that's just, it's so unfair. And not to mention the fact that we're forced to utilize this very low quality study drug that's not representative of real world cannabis, and it's harming outcomes of these studies. So the vets are in this catch-22 where they're trying to reform public policy, but in order to change policy, you have to have data from randomized controlled trials. But these trials are being sabotaged by this lousy cannabis and by all these layers of government red tape that are causing scientists to walk away from this work because they think it's impossible to do. So I would say one of the things that's been most surprising is doing research like this in Canada, in Israel. I get to work with military veterans there who not only have safe legal access to lab-tested cannabis, but their cost of their cannabis is fully sponsored by their federal government and has been for 10 years now. They've always had their cannabis paid for. So it's really striking that our allies in these other countries have always seen cannabis as a medicine and felt it was beneficial for their vets, and taxpayers want to pay for veterans to have cannabis. But here we can't even get them legal access.
Thank you, Dr. Sue. Ryan Miller.
These are some tough acts to follow, but I'm going to do my best. So I've given away hundreds of pounds of cannabis and concentrates and topicals and tinctures to military veterans for free. There's a lot of people that are going to make a lot of money off cannabis, and I just want to give it away for free. And I do this because the VA can't. I go to mental health at the VA every month, And when we first started my treatment, I told him that I'm not willing to take any pharmaceuticals. And that really narrowed his options for how he could treat me. And cannabis has really filled those gaps. And with the whole generous philanthropic intentions of the cannabis community, we've been able to fill the gaps that the VA can't due to policy. And it's really something we shouldn't have to do. I want to do other things with my life, right? But I can't really do that right now because our troops are suffering. Our troops are desperately seeking options. And really, Prop 64 made cannabis legal and accessible to everybody over 18, or 21, if you can afford it. And so, just in closing, opiates are free at the VA, antidepressants are free at the VA, jumping off the Golden Gate Bridge is free. We need free access to cannabis.
Thank you, Ryan, very much.
So, yeah, I'll go ahead. So, we've talked about the VA and what it's doing. And again, there's some good, there's some bad, but there's also, where your location is. So regardless of the new rules, when I moved out to California, I got into, and I live in Oakland, probably one of the most cannabis-friendly places on earth. I could be very confident about and share, how I use cannabis with my medical providers all across the VA, and never felt judged, and even had a lot of support from everyone from physical therapists to mental health professionals. Now imagine you're somewhere in, where cannabis is frowned upon, and you have a medical care team that doesn't have this same view and understanding, and it's really, again, about understanding, education, acceptance. And, I know folks in these locations that will, can't tell their provider that they're using cannabis. And if they want to maintain in the VA, a lot of times if they're on other psychotropic medication, they have to get urinalysis. So that limits their ability to replace those with cannabis because they fear, even if they're allowed and it's in the rules, regardless of rules, you can be in a very repressive system that can still, find ways to make you suffer. And that's what's happening. Or folks are, using cannabis, getting kicked out, and then, in a lot of these locations, cannabis is viewed in the same way and as harmful as opiates, heroin, fentanyl, methamphetamines. And they say, well, hell, I'm just going to use those. And that's why I am 100% convinced, and one of the reasons I got into cannabis is because when I started seeing how access was literally saving lives, and how folks without access, people I recovered with, initially in 2007 in Walter Reed, 2010 down in Fort Sam Houston, who are living in places without access and who are dying. I am convinced that there are a few people I know that would still be friends, brothers and sisters in arms, that would still be alive today had they access to cannabis. So again, getting that access and understanding, the education across the country, so your doctor, whether they like it or not, can't say anything. And then again, having it affordability access, so you don't have to choose free opiates and free other psychotropics over your cannabis. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Next question, and if we can try to limit the answers to 1 to 2 minutes so we can get through everybody and then have another question. If there was one word that came to mind with respect to the way forward, close your eyes for a minute. What is the word that comes to mind with respect to getting through the multiple complexity of issues and emotions that affect all of you and all of the other veterans? Life, please.
Hemp. Helping educate misinformed people.
I love that. That's fantastic. That's fantastic.
And the reason why I say that, and by listening to the other panelists here, working for the VA and working as a soldier, as a medic, we're giving a motto: conserve the fighting strength. That was something that was instilled in us at Fort Sam Houston and wherever we go. As a senior non-commissioned officer, my job was to ensure that I save lives, period. No questions, no emotions, that's the job. And I was awarded a lot of awards for saving lives. But now this is something different now. And so again, hemp, we gotta educate the people on what's really going on. As a VA employee, we're told not to speak on certain things that we find out because of the repercussions that comes with it, the questions that most people don't want to answer. My job now is to give them those answers so that they can make a consolidated decision about their quality of life. We deserve to live. We deserve to have a second chance on life. And if we don't do that, we won't have a life to live. So hemp, helping educate misinformed people.
Thank you very much. Beautifully spoken. Joy.
The word that comes to mind for me is vote. To me, putting pressure on your legislators, local, state level, nationally, asking them, engaging them or their people in what the candidates' stance on legalization is, how they plan to move forward in the cannabis space, and because only a fool politician will deny that it helps anymore. They're foolish to take a negative stance on it. So educating yourself, educating your legislators and the people around you, educating your community, and voting for people who support the same mission that you do.
Thank you very much. Sean, what word comes to your mind?
I'm going to take a little different tone and try not to be so negative this time. Inequity, and that's the word that comes to my mind is, and I will say that I think a big part of the issue with the legal market is the inequity of the supply chain, the inequity of the patient, that relationship with that legal supply chain. And unless we fix that, I fear we're going to lose some of the support for this change that we have at our forefront. If we can't solve that issue, we're up in Sacramento a lot, and I can tell you right now, it's looking like an omnibus bill is more likely daily. And so I think we as a legal market in California have to think about this more than just profits and regulation. We've had a lot of input from the people who don't like cannabis and want to regulate the hell out of it. We have a lot of input from the government who loves the tax receipts they're not getting. Well, the reason you're not getting because you basically created a market, as it's been said here and it's been said for a long time, you've created a legal market for the privileged. That's all you've done. And the very rare user who can afford to pay $60+ I mean, an eighth of flour is easily, that's basically what Canada gives to its vets for free. So now just do, whatever an eighth of flour is times 30 days a month, and you get just a starting budget of what it costs. To say 100% disabled vet who gets $2,900 and some odd change a month to live on, half that's going just to Medicaid on cannabis. Now that's not what's going on. They're growing it illegally. They're sourcing it from the black market, and the black market's winning. So if we don't fix this, I think quickly, you're starting to see the pushback on cannabis pretty hard in the press. And I think they're going to use these failures we have against us, and we're going to lose some of the momentum. So I think inequity is someplace that I don't hear a lot at these talks because it's mainly predominantly people in industry, and we can write our own demographic how we want it, but it alludes to something. So that's what I would say.
Thank you, Sean. Todd?
I would say leadership, right? So Ryan and I both attended probably the premier leadership institution on the planet. When we went to West Point, we studied under a banner of duty, honor, and country. And we were to be inspired to a lifetime of service to the nation. We were commissioned to fight and win our nation's wars, and at the root of all of that was to take care of those whom we led. So we've done that, and I think it takes a certain type of bold, courageous leadership to be able to look at others and to apply critical thinking skills to this particular subject and come up with creative solutions to what I believe is an incredibly complex issue. And I believe that is post-traumatic stress and chronic pain and a number of societal issues. But the military is uniquely positioned, I think, to really forward a lot of these advances, and has been responsible for a number of different societal issue changes and been the first mover on this in a number of different instances. And I can cite, interracial ranks, with African Americans serving among the ranks of the military. The Buffalo Soldier, Buffalo Soldier is from the military and started right in Fort Leavenworth, right where I am living today. We've also advanced significantly women in the military, and a number of different societal issues have really spawned from that. So I'm sorry I'm rambling a bit, but I get a bit emotional about it.
As
but
you
truly,
should.
I think leadership is what is currently lacking on this particular subject, and someone to be bold enough to say, wait a minute, guess what? We were lied to for the last 80 some odd years under Prohibition, when we were told all of these negative impacts of this plant that have not come to fruition. The worst thing about cannabis is its prohibition and the effect on the American society, and that effect we then exported it to the rest of the world and convinced them that marijuana was bad as well. So anyway, leadership, final answer. Thank you.
Thank you, Todd. Dr. Sue.
Sure, I would say funding, because I think, these randomized controlled trials are so expensive. The veterans study we just finished was $2.3 million, and that's common for controlled trials. If Big Pharma did the same trial, it would have been $5 million. But the bottom line is, these veterans have been so generous. They've been functioning as the tip of the spear in this cannabis movement, changing hearts and minds and helping us reform policies and change laws. And we need to back them up with rigorous controlled data published in peer-reviewed medical journals in order to persuade these big federal agencies to change scheduling, things like that. So if we're going to do that, we've got to persuade. There's all these people profiting from cannabis, as Sean mentioned. There's corporate behemoths now that are, bajillion dollars in revenue, just, swimming in money. They could easily be allocating, a few $1 million a year to do clinical trials, working with vets. I have to say, I've done clinical trials most of my life, and veterans have been the best population I've ever worked with. They're so dedicated. There's, when it comes to compliance to a protocol that's, unparalleled, their commitment to doing the right, working conscientiously on these protocols and following the rules. And so I think that if we can persuade not just these big multi-state operators to begin to donate a significant amount of their revenue to research, but also whenever you're crafting ballot initiatives in these new states, if we can make sure that some of the sales tax revenue goes into clinical trials so that we can persuade more scientists to do this work. We can't rely on our government to fund drug development research on cannabis as a medicine. They're just not going to do it. The 99% of the funding that we have available is still going to safety studies looking at harmful side effects and addiction potential of cannabis. So we have to create our own funding path.
Thank you, Sue.
May I just,
Ryan.
I'm glad Todd mentioned leadership, because I like this idea of heart-led. And the way that we define that in cannabis is this idea of compassion. Compassion is an idea of transferring cannabis free of charge between folks philanthropically. And it's created in San Francisco in the Castro by Brownie Mary Rathbun and Air Force Vietnam veteran Dennis Perone. And so I think the more that we can, I appreciate everyone sitting here and demonstrating that you give a shit, right? That you care enough about the troops to show up today. So thank you. That's demonstrating compassion. So the more compassion we can demonstrate for the troops, the more we can demonstrate compassion for anti-war activists and indigenous water protectors, right? The less we'll need war, and the less we'll need warriors, especially if we can fix the inequality that Sean was speaking to.
Thank you, Ryan. Ryan.
Related to that, the one word I think is love. And here's why. So from a practical standpoint, what do you need to change things? You need the voting. How do you get that voting? It's through education. Well, in theory, and maybe we haven't done the best job of this in this country, but, how do you, when you're educating folks, what are you doing? You're showing love. Society is showing love to its children by educating them, to take over as the next generation. So information spreads in two ways primarily, and again, it goes back to our animal nature, fear and love. For a very long time, they've been using fear to keep this down, to keep people oppressed, to use this as a mechanism of control. But in the end, we know, and I'm not trying to be cheesy here, we know eventually love wins. So by showing love to this and spreading the word, the veteran community, we're spreading the word to other veterans. And folks like you, who again, we're so honored you're here and listening to us, please go out there, show that love by educating your peers, your friends, elected officials on what this plan is currently doing for veterans and what it can do for society as a whole. And that will, again, that's how we're going to change this, and that's how we're going to win, and we're going to win soon.
Thank you. We have 5 minutes left. One final question, and please limit your answer to 30 seconds to a minute. I want you to imagine we're hitting the fast forward button, the genie's out of the bottle, and whether it's executive order by a sitting president or an act of Congress, cannabis is legalized. What are the things we need to do now to prepare for that so there isn't another 5 years of government bureaucracy to get cannabis into the hands of veterans? Thank you.
My 30-second spiel is doing this, forming a cohesive alliance among like-minded individuals who is mission-oriented to ensure that we get the best of the best. Again, you have various forms and various types of cannabis out there, some that's not even cannabis. And yet people are buying stuff online, they don't know what it is, it's not being tested. I mean, it's a lot going on. But if we come as an organized, power to me is organized effort. This is power, right? Different people coming together. And so again, I think the coalition or alliance building amongst those that are out there advocating for this is very critical, and that's what I would say to them.
Thank you, Live. Joy?
Can you repeat the question one more time?
Sure. I'm pushing the button and cannabis is legal. What are the steps we need to take immediately now to efficiently effectuate that so we don't have years of bureaucracy once it is legalized?
I think there's power in the spoken word and breaking down the stigma regarding cannabis, the false stigma that's been pervasive in our society at large for decades now has to be brought down, and it comes by people like us, and average everyday Americans, first responders, and luckily the veteran voice does carry some weight to it. More people telling their stories means it lessens the power of that negative, incorrect stigma. We reduce the stigma, there's less bureaucracy we should have to deal with after it's
Thank you so much, Sean.
Yeah, I would just quickly say, I think when I start talking now how we want this legalization to work, because too often in our country, the ear of government tilted towards a select few, and that's the moneyed interest. So for example, with Prop 64 and 215, those are two very different economies, and I'd raise the question, who is benefiting? One had a wide community participation, you look at the events, they all different races, colors, genders, empowered the small farmer, the small grower, versus 64, which is corporate top down. And I think we have to ask ourselves, is there something endemic to the system we're in place that's analogous to the greater issues here? And so I think we need to start talking about what's important and really need to start bringing the representation to the table so it's not just those select few. For example, in California, patients were not at the table with 64. So like a Bill of Rights is now being discussed to attach to the omnibus bill. And so that's what I would say is we have to start talking about how we accomplish that.
Thank you, Sean. Todd, 1 minute, please.
Okay, so there are a lot of policies that would have to go into place, but I think what we should do is start with the end in mind, right? And we're talking about the development of a cannabis industry, and it will be a global industry. This is the industry our children will inherit. So if we start with that in mind and create the industry, everyone asks me all the time, what industry you want to follow or mimic? I say none. I want other industries to look at us and say that this is an industry that has developed, that has a thread of kindness, compassion, and generosity with great purpose associated with it, right? And this is an industry that we should place high standards on ourselves to grow this amazing plant very sustainably and efficiently, and translate that into the way we grow our food, and to ensure that the decisions that we make have impact socially, in terms of potentially reversing a number of the ills that were created by the prohibition of marijuana in the first place, and then obviously establishing the framework or the rubric for the research of cannabis. How many times have you all smoked cannabis and said, "Oh my God, that's a miracle. Someone should look into that," right? Let's make that happen, right? And a lot of that has to do with releasing the funding and developing those research relationships.
Thanks, Todd. Sue?
I agree. Ending the DEA monopoly will be the biggest solution for getting scientific freedom when it comes to studying cannabis as a medicine. So we have to pressure the DEA to finally license other growers for research so that we scientists can access real-world cannabis flower. And then finally we'll be able to see a renaissance of cannabis research in this country that really represents what patients are experiencing from day to day.
Thank you so much, Ryan.
So the first thing that we have to do is release all the political prisoners that are currently incarcerated. And let's be real, they're folks that don't look like me, right? And so we also need to reinvest into the communities that have been disproportionately harmed by the war on drugs. And it's my responsibility to mention that, so thank you.
Finally, Ryan Miller.
Thank you. And I'll echo that to a degree. Equity, equity, equity. We have an opportunity in this industry, starting from zero, to create one that maximizes benefits to as many people as possible, that spreads the wealth as much as possible. And right now, we're actually not on that path. And again, it has to do with regulation, some regulatory capture. Like Sean mentioned, 215, spread the wealth, 64 does not. So it's, we're already, I think, past the point of no return with the capital requirements in this state and others. So it really is a responsibility then of those big companies to buck the typical system of maximizing and consolidating their value and going out there and supporting equity programs and creating as much wealth to as many people as possible.
Thank you so much. Panel, it's been extraordinary. Thank you so much for coming today. Thank you so much for your service, your sacrifice for all of us here in this room. And we are there for you to help you in any way. Everybody, please thank our panel. Can we all get a picture under the American flag, please? Scooch in. Squeeze in. Okay. Should I hold him up so he's in the picture? Can I hold him up? Can I lift him? Yeah, go for it. Hold it. Hold it. Okay. 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 Scooch together. Okay.
Get tight. Get tight. Get tight.
My hand okay?
Yeah, you're fine.
Okay. Thank you, everybody. 2 minutes before the next round. Okay. Yeah, sure.
Who's going to give us this? Yeah, who's going to give us this? Got me, Lee? Get in there tight, brother. It's all about the puppy.
And no one cares about it.